Thank you for this opportunity to speak to this audience. I think when I heard the introduction to this series of talks, that the question was ill-formed. What can neuroscience add to the field of creativity? I think is perhaps reversed almost 180 degrees. From my experience, it's been what can creativity add to the field of neuroscience. It's been about 8 years since I've entered this field, and I've found that through thinking about creativity and struggling with constructs of creativity, that I've learned much more about the brain than I ever knew before. And this is coming from research that I've done in the world of intelligence, working with patients. But creativity has really allowed me to struggle with these issues and try to understand the brain a bit more. So I'd like to take you on a bit of that journey. All of my ideas are ill-formed as well, so I'm taking you on a journey that is a work in process. So I want you to know that these are ideas that are still in formation, and sometimes I get ideas from audience members, I get ideas from fellow colleagues, but I don't pretend that this is a fully formed concept. But I think it's on the right path. I think I'm learning something about the brain that's important. As Dr. Kaufman said, we do have a pretty good definition of creativity. It is the production of something both novel and useful. And I like this dichotomy of this definition, that there is novelty on the one hand, which you can think of as producing new things, but there's utility, and artists in particular hate that part of the definition. What's useful about my art and about what I produce? But you think about your audience when you're producing your creative work. You want to make sure that it reaches out to them and perhaps emotionally or intellectually or politically, as you were talking about. So there is a utility, there is a usefulness in this novelty making that you can reach out for, even at the far reaches of creative endeavors, even if artists are resistant to this concept. But this bifurcation of novelty and usefulness is a touchstone that I want to keep coming back to in my talk, because it gets to these different networks that I'm going to talk to about in creative cognition as well. This left brain, right brain thing, I can't remember if you touched on this in your myths, but it's one of the most pernicious myths of the neuroscience of creativity, that somehow your left brain is logical and linear and your right brain is all about rainbows and unicorns and donuts, and that couldn't be more wrong. You need your whole brain to be creative. It requires both your left brain and your right brain to do this creative thing that is so important to adaptive human behavior, and perhaps adaptive behavior across all of the species. So both left and right brain and your body, this embodied brain, is very important. We can't separate the brain from the rest of the body and the senses. This embodied brain is extremely important in considering creative behavior. So I'm starting to think about creativity from an evolutionary perspective as well. And I think it's important that this is not just a human capacity, but if creativity is something important to human behavior, and if it is an adaptive human behavior, it probably should be evident in other species as well. And it should be evident across evolutionary time if it is an adaptive quality of the human brain, right? So I've started to look in other species. Well, before I get to that, I've looked in the literature, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination an expert in evolutionary psychology or evolutionary thought, but I've looked at some of other people's thinking on this subject. And there's an interesting dichotomy in this research as well. Cosmides and Tooby talk about, in 1987, the trade-off between problem-solving power and specialization. They hypothesized two different constraints in the human cognitive capacity. There's a general purpose problem-solving architectures, which are very weak but broad in their applications. It's very hard to read. And special purpose problem-solving designs, which are very efficient and inferentially powerful, but limited in their domain of application. If you think about your day today, There's lots of things that you engaged in today that are very automatic, thinking about what you're going to do for breakfast or how to get from point A to B. There's lots of things that are a very automatic part of your day that are very efficient, powerful, and limited in their domain of applicability. But we encounter problems in our day-to-day lives, in relationships, and in the world in general that require that specialization power of the human brain, that novelty generator that allows us to do that creative thing, that allows us to solve that 1 in 20 or that 1 in 100 type of problem that comes up every once in a while. We have to have both those problem-solving capacities in the human brain. The 95% of the time where we solve very automatic problems, but that rare occasion where we haven't seen that thing before, that relationship that's gone sour that we have to bring back in because we want it to work. How do we do that? How do we solve that type of problem that we haven't seen before? It's going to take a more deliberate type of effort. And there's so many types of problems that we could solve throughout the day that it causes this combinatorial explosion. There's so many different problems that you could be solving that it's inferentially impossible to calculate all the problems that you're solving at any given time. Most of the problems you're solving are automated by your brain. So this special purpose cognitive system is involved in useful reasoning. You have to have some things that are just automated that you can solve offline. I think this sounds kind of right to me. I think this is involved in deductive type of reasoning where there's cause-effect relationships. I think it's efficient and powerful. This is something like intelligence that I've studied previously. It's limited in its application because you have an identified problem that's there to be solved. And like I said, it's more involved in intelligent problem solving. However, there's this situation-specific improvisation that's also required in our day-to-day lives. It's very adaptive as well. It's involved in novel reasoning. It's involved in abduction. It's weak. It's broad in its application. You were talking about remote associates. It's that ability to pull things in from outside of your normal realm of thinking, and that remote association can come together to solve a problem that you hadn't solved before. I think that has something to do with creativity. So intelligence, as we understand it, and creativity are working side by side in order to do adaptive reasoning. So an example of this intelligent thing I think we can find in other species. This is Tursiops aduncus. This is a dolphin species found off the coast of Australia, Shark Bay. Interestingly, only females engage in this behavior, but they engage in this tool-using behavior where they use this basket sponge to protect their beak to forage for fish. So they're sandy bottoms, the fish are hiding in the sandy bottoms, and they're scratching the sandy bottoms and flushing the fish up from the sandy bottoms. That kind of hurts your beak when you do this. So they figured out if they put this basket sponge over the beak, they can forage in the sandy bottoms, flush the fish up, drop the basket, catch the fish. This is tool use. This is very intelligent, adaptive behavior in another species, by the way. Now, we have any number of examples of situation-specific improvisation, and here's a prototypical example, but we have dolphins from this as well. I don't know if this sound will come through. Sound won't come through. However, I can explain this to you. These dolphins are blowing bubbles. This is in an aquarium, and these dolphins are blowing bubble rings that they are using to play. This is not particularly useful activity. We don't know what they're doing actually, but it's novel behavior, it's playful behavior. And if another dolphin tries to come up and play with an individual who's made the bubbles ring, that individual will pop it. That's my ring. So there's some sort of socially adaptive type of behavior going on, perhaps in these dolphins, but it's less utility and more novelty. It's certainly on the creative end of the spectrum. So there's this novelty and usefulness even in other species like dolphins. So where is creativity in the brain? This is the $64,000 brain, and the good news is we don't know. I'm not going to tell you that it's in your entire brain. I just said I think it's in your left hemisphere, in your right hemisphere. We don't know where creativity resides. It doesn't reside in any one spot in your brain, but we think that networks help. And let me tell you about networks. Actually, let me tell you first about the path that we went on to discover that networks were important in the brain. If we use the same measures, and Dr. Kaufman was talking about these measures of divergent thinking, and we use the consensual assessment technique, and this, again, has nothing to do with sex. It's about getting consensus over these different measures of creativity, and we use the consensual assessment technique to look at these measures of divergent thinking and mostly college students. This is a picture of my brain, actually. I'll play that for you again. So this is the cortical surface of my brain. And it's beautiful, I think, but that's just me. But beyond being beautiful, it's an example of brain structure. And while it might be beautiful, you need to get numbers to do science. And so what we can do is we can actually measure the cortical thickness at 186,000 tessellated vectors, which sounds complicated, it is. And we can measure the cortical thickness at each of those vectors in the surface of the brain. We can look at the processors, the neural cell bodies, and the thickness of that at the surface of the brain. It's very important. It differs from me to you across the human population. On average, it's about the same, to 2 to 3 millimeters on average on the surface of the brain. But at an individual spot, Dr. Kaufman might have 3 millimeters in a certain region of the brain. I might have 2 millimeters. You might have 4 millimeters. And that difference might be interesting if it's associated with a different cognitive task. I don't do functional studies, I do structural studies. I look at your brain while you're just lying in a scanner, not dancing or doing anything else. I want to see the structure of your brain and how that's correlated with your abilities outside of the scanner. So we asked a very basic question very early on in our studies. Where in the brain is cortical thickness associated with creativity? And we used the entire brain, and we were one of the first people to do this, so we get to ask these kind of ridiculous questions, these very broad, open-ended kind of fishing expeditions is what we call them in the science. So that, this is kind of a fishing expedition type of question. And we found something very interesting. We found that there was one particular region in the brain where creative achievement, and now this is a different measure that Dr. Kaufman didn't get into, but looking at the times that your poetry has been published and if it's been nationally recognized, internationally recognized, these are actual creative achievements out in the world. And you order your individual achievements across 10 different domains, from culinary arts, scientific, writing, poetry, dance, lots of different actual creative achievements. Where in the brain does creative achievement correlate with cortical thickness? And we found this one region of the brain conveniently circled and with an arrow attached that showed that cortical thickness was correlated with creative achievement. Now the interesting thing that's a little hard to see is that the region is blue. Usually you see these regions in yellow or red or, kind of jumping out at you. The reason that it's in blue is because it was cortical thinning that was associated with creative achievement. It wasn't more neurons, but fewer neurons that was associated with higher creative achievement. It was an inverse relationship. I want you to keep that in mind when we go to our next study. Now this is the white matter of my brain, and this will animate showing again. This is perhaps even more beautiful than the last example I showed you. It's going through the corpus callosum and showing an articulation of the white matter tracts. These are the wires that connect up the different cortical regions of the brain, connecting those different processing modules and allowing information to flow from point A to B to C and so on, to bring these networks together. And this is using probabilistic tractography, allowing us to show how different regions are connected together. And again, we ask this very basic question: where in the brain is white matter connectivity correlated with creativity? Now we use the consensual assessment technique, looked at divergent thinking, and we found this very nice region articulated. Now this is slicing through the brain from the top, so you're looking down from the top of the brain and seeing a region in the frontal lobe. These are the frontal lobes. These are the frontal lobes, temporal lobes, parietal lobes back here. But a region in the left frontal lobe, and I have to think about that because this is radiological convention, and radiologists get paid more because left is right and right is left, basically. So in the left frontal lobe, you have a region where you have lower neuronal axonal fidelity associated with higher creative ability in our college students. Again, this inverse relationship. Now we started to have to interpret these findings. Why in normal college students without any whiff of neurological disorder do you see these inverse relationships? And we started to interpret this as frontal disinhibition. So if you think of your frontal lobes as basically keeping you out of trouble, look before you leap, ready, aim, fire, this type of activity. There's accelerators and there's brakes in your frontal lobes. And this is kind of individuals that had their foot on the gas pedal and off the brake. So they were able to put more information, more ideas together, we hypothesized, by virtue of having more connectivity throughout the frontal lobe, a disinhibitory model. So it wasn't just our research that we focused on, but we did a survey of all the structural neuroimaging research that was out there. These are lesion studies, so looking at patients that had traumatic brain injury and stroke, looking at cortical thickness studies, looking at voxel-based morphometry. We did a survey of all the structural neuroimaging studies that were out there to see where in the brain these different relationships were and whether they were positive or negative. And where you see these red blobs are where the positive relationships were found in the brain. Where the blue blobs are where these negative relationships or inverse relationships were found, where you have higher creativity but lower measures of neuronal fidelity, whether it's overt lesions of the brain, holes in the brain caused by stroke or traumatic brain injury, where it's a less cortical thickness, where it's lower white matter fidelity. Very interesting pattern of relationships, and it maps on to this very interesting network of the brain called the default mode network. Now this is a network that was discovered I don't know, in the 1990s, but was brought to prominence more recently by Randy Buckner and other people because it is a network of the brain that was previously thought to be become more active when you're not doing anything with your brain. It is a task unrelated type of network associated with your brain. We're finding that this network of the brain is actually doing some very interesting things. It's active when individuals are engaged in internally focused thought, not engaging in the external world. Autobiographical memory retrieval, envisioning the future, conceiving the perspectives of others, flexible construction of mental simulation. This mental simulation ability is very overlaps significantly with the default mode network. And think about mental simulation, how important that is to adaptive behavior, that you can try an idea before you buy it out in the external world. I don't know if other species do this, but this is a very adaptive behavior to be able to try things out in your mind's eye before you put it out in the real world. This is what the default mode network looks like in the brain. This is white matter tractography. This is the medial prefrontal lobe region that's activated, medial temporal, the inferior parietal, the precuneus, and posterior cingulate cortex. These are different regions of the brain, very medially located, middle parts of the brain, inside parts of the brain that are associated with the default mode network, as opposed to the lateral parts of the brain that are associated with task-positive activities when you're thinking about ideas in the external world, when you're implementing ideas in the external world. So I've come to a tentative conclusion for your approval, that I think there are two very important networks in the brain. I think they're both involved in creative cognition, actually. One we tend to call intelligence. It's an external thought network that is associated with, it's called the cognitive control network. It's associated with regions on the external surface of the brain. You'll see some of those articulated here in an fMRI study. And we did a very big review in behavioral and brain sciences where we articulated significant overlap between this network and regions associated with intelligent behavior. I think it's involved in rule-based cognitive system. It's involved in deduction, cognition in the external world, and I think it will have significant overlap with intellect, which is an aspect of personality and, in fact, creative cognition. We've segregated intelligence and intellect from creative cognition to our expense. But when you think about how creativity is implemented, we implement creative ideas in the external world. We might have thought about them originally, and the first speaker talked about this. We might have planned out some ideas internally, but we have to implement these ideas in the external world. This is in contrast to the internal thought network, which overlaps significantly with the default mode network. It's situation-specific improvisation. It's involved with induction, abduction, mental simulation, creative cognition. I think this novelty generator, I think, is very important and overlaps significantly with the default mode network, and involved with the openness aspect of personality. So this dynamic interplay, this bifurcation again of novelty and usefulness, of the left brain and the right brain, of the default mode network and the cognitive control network. I think we're getting at very important interplay. It's not an either-or proposition, but a both proposition when it comes to creative cognition. Thank you for your attention.